Good afternoon. Welcome to Juniper Research's top 10 tech predictions for 2023. I'm Sam Barker, Head of Analytics and Forecasting here at Juniper Research. With me are my colleagues Nick Maynard, Head of Research, and Scarlett Woodford, Principal Analyst. Before we go through our slides, I'd like to talk to you about a small change we have to our format this year. We're continuing with the top 10 predictions. However, we'll be focusing more on the top 5 rather than trends 10 through 6. And we believe that these 5 trends will have a significant impact on 2023. For those of you who don't know us, we specialize in identifying and appraising high growth markets within the digital sectors. We provide market research across 50 technology markets, and it's these reports that underpin our technology predictions for next year. So for over a decade now, Juniper Research has been providing recommendations and predictions for the year ahead. We focus on technologies, devices, and solutions that we feel will have a disruptive impact on digital markets in the following year. We look at events like CES and Mobile World Congress, and we'll also speak to industry thought leaders to assist us in providing and coming up with our predictions. Our team of experienced industry analysts whittle down a long list of possibles into a shorter list of probables, and these become our basis for what we think will happen next year. So during the course of the webinar, we'll go through different areas. Looking at each trend, we'll define the trend and what we believe will happen, why we think it will happen next year in 2023, and as importantly, we'll be looking at how the economic and the anticipated economic downturn will be impacting the trend or having an effect on it. We'll also be looking at who is impacted, and finally, we'll be providing Juniper Research prediction on how this trend will pan out. We're moving now on to trend number 10. To kick us off, which is that CBRS will provide competition for 5G-based private networks in the US. So first of all, what is CBRS? So CBRS is an alternative to 4G or LTE or 5G-based private networks. CBRS stands for Citizens Broadband Radio Service, and what's interesting about it is how the economic downturn is going to have an impact on it. So CBRS itself is a band of spectrum outlined by the FCC in the US that provides high bandwidth and low latency connectivity over wireless spectrum, which is essentially providing competition to spectrum over LTE and 5G networks, which is owned by the operators themselves. What's interesting to note is the 3 tiers that are available over the FCC's CBRS offering. Firstly, incumbents, which are those who are already using it. Priority access is for those who pay for it. But we'd like to focus on the bottom tier here, the general authorized access, or the GAA licenses. These are the licenses that are offered for free. If priority access is given or paid for by other companies, then these licenses will lose it. But we feel this is important because GAA greatly reduces the cost of owning these private networks. And in a time when economic uncertainty is very, very high, the ability to reduce the cost or the ownership of a private network is something that is going to be significantly sought after. Now, one area that we've looked at is agriculture. Looking again, something that's specific to the US is the agriculture industry and the prevalence of super farms, which are those farms that are owned by a single entity but over a large area of land. So the ability to monitor that area of land through a wireless spectrum is something that's already highly sought after, but the ability for CBRS to provide that connectivity rather than having to work with operators directly for the spectrum is something that's going to be incredibly or highly valued. This is another area that we believe that will cause this, is that there's not going to be very much demand for spectrum in a particular place. There's not going to be a lot of competition for that spectrum itself. So why 2023? There's already an increased demand for private networks. When private LTE networks were launched 4 or 5 years ago, LTE was very much something that was the best in class in terms of connectivity. 5G was obviously launched a couple of years later, and we're seeing even greater focus on 5G, as 4G almost acts as a stepping stone. And CBRS is something that we believe will provide an alternative for these two technologies, the ability to minimize which stakeholders are involved and which service providers can provide spectrum. So what do we think will happen? Well, to put it plain and simply, an increasing number of private networks will be leveraging CBRS for connectivity. It uses very similar spectrums to what LTE and 5G use today. As a result, the only difference between that and using spectrum paid for by operators is essentially the cost. And we'd like to highlight that it's the GAA account that is really going to have a real big impact in 2023 for private networks in the US. I will now hand you over to my colleague Scarlett, who will take you through trend number 9.
Thank you very much, Sam. I'm now going to take you through the 9th trend, which is that the deployment of eSIM-only Android smartphones will proliferate, following Apple's example. So, what is the opportunity that this trend brings? Well, eSIM profiles really make it easier for consumers to switch between network operator profiles. And in 2022, Apple released the eSIM-only iPhone 14, initially in the US as a test bed, but we anticipate that this will roll out to Europe within 2023. This becomes problematic in markets that are highly competitive, as operators see eSIM technology as potentially disruptive to their business models, with operators in countries like the US and the UK really prioritizing loyalty and trying to reduce that churn of subscribers. We anticipate that Apple's influence on the ecosystem will really drive operators to support eSIM. And how will the economic downturn in 2023 impact this trend? Well, consumer spend is going to be on top of mind for everyone, really. And demand for high-end eSIM-enabled smartphones will fall as consumers look to save money. In terms of why 2023, we've seen that Apple have launched the eSIM-only iPhone 14, and we anticipate that the iPhone 15 will really solidify this position when it's launched in approximately September. And in terms of what we think will happen, we've mentioned that Apple launched the eSIM-only device in the US as a testbed, with expansion into Europe expected. However, they're very much limited to their other major market, which is China, as regulations prevent OEMs from using eSIMs within smartphones in the market. This limits innovation. If a similar regionally specific regulation was in place, this would enable Chinese manufacturers to release mid and low-end eSIM-enabled smartphones, which is really going to be key to driving market growth. I'll now pass you on to Nick, who will discuss our next trends.
So, thanks, Scarlett. Number 8 is AI to drive adoption of personalised healthcare treatments. So let's get into this trend. What do we mean here? So what we're seeing is that there is now increased ability to actually make healthcare treatments personal to the patient. This is achieved via a variety of methods. We're seeing increased use of precision medicine in terms of genetic testing. Also, we are seeing a lot of digital therapeutics brought into place, which again allow the use of machine learning to personalize how healthcare is delivered. And the key here is really efficiency in terms of this. By personalizing how healthcare is delivered, that actually means that fundamentally it's more efficient, there's less waste, and resolution to issues can be quicker. So there's real benefits in this for both the healthcare providers and the actual patients themselves. And it's important to look at this within the context of the economic downturn in 2023. As I mentioned, it's all about efficiency. With that lens, healthcare systems are going to be very much under pressure. They've had a lot of difficulty through the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think the economic downturn is really accelerating that in terms of the difficulties that are being had there. So any ability to improve efficiency in the system is going to be really beneficial. And why 2023? I think the pressure is on. for healthcare providers, they've got resources that are actually dwindling a bit in terms of how they can actually fund a lot of this, and that's very challenging. Where it's insurer-led, a lot of people will struggle to pay the premiums as things get tighter. So actually reducing those resources is really beneficial. That will really come across in 2023, and the technology has come to a point where it's mature enough to really achieve what it needs to. And fundamentally, our prediction here is that personalised treatments driven by AI will become an increasingly important part of the future of healthcare, and 2023 will really be the year where we see that start to happen. So that's going to be really significant. And with that, it's back to Scarlett for the next trend.
Thank you very much, Nick. So I'll talk us through trend number 7, which is that the growth of OTT business messaging will really trigger the separation of A2P and P2P channels. So first, for a little bit of context and some definitions, A2P messaging, otherwise known as business messaging or application-to-person messaging, refers to the process by which an enterprise contacts an end user. This can include automation via chatbots. And this is very much in comparison to P2P or person-to-person communications, which involve two human entities. OTT channels include things like WhatsApp and WeChat, which are those third-party applications that have commonly had a established P2P use case. In terms of how the economic downturn will impact the trend, what we're seeing is that consumer spend will fall, especially on unnecessary purchases. And for this reason, enterprises will invest heavily in targeted advertising, really looking to reach the consumers on their preferred platforms at the right time to ensure a conversion. In terms of 2023 and why we think this trend will emerge next year, we've seen the banning of WhatsApp in India really highlighting the need for further regulations to stop spam and to stop fraud. And in terms of what we think will happen, we believe that app developers will follow examples set by applications like the Google Mail inbox and the native Android messaging applications by separating the A2P and P2P channels, therefore protecting the P2P experience and preventing any damage being done there. And with that, I'll pass this on to Nick, who will talk us through the next trend.
Lovely. Thanks, Scarlett. So on to trend number 6, which is eMobility to solve the last mile problem for mobility as a service solutions. So let's get into this one. Ultimately, what we're seeing is mobility as a service is a system where travelers can access multiple different modes of transit within an urban environment via one app, where they can pay, ride, and do everything they need to do to get around that urban environment. What this, however, is struggling against is the convenience of a private car. In terms of private car journeys are still very convenient in terms of you can usually drive pretty close to your destination and park. And crucial for MaaS's evolution and growth is actually making it more convenient for MaaS users to directly reach their destination. And that's a really important factor in growing MaaS adoption. So what we are seeing here is that eMobility is going to be leveraged by mobility as a service vendors to eliminate this last mile challenge and really get that end user all the way to the end point of their journey. That's going to be a game changer for mobility as a service and will help it achieve stronger growth. So why is that going to be driven by this economic downturn we're seeing? Ultimately, users are really motivated by cost when it comes to travel. We have seen this for a long time, that this is really compelling. And as the cost of living crisis bites and as people lose their jobs and economic circumstances get more difficult, that's going to be a real issue. So it's important that actually mobility as a service applications show value for money. And really, with some of the fuel price rises we've seen, that looks very possible. So we think that's going to have a really strong impact here in terms of incentivizing this use. And why 2023? So we've seen MaaS deployments have really started to gain traction in markets such as China. We've seen Beijing, Shanghai launch some really good MaaS platforms. So that's really important. There's a lot of environmental concern around. We've just seen COP27 and a lot of public debate around that. And I think the cost pressures, as we've mentioned, are going to be a really significant factor driving further MaaS use as well. So there's a lot of growth here, and I think we're going to see this going forward. And we can see on the right there that micro-mobility is going to be a really significant factor in the number of MaaS miles that are travelled. So that's really important to note. And ultimately, we're predicting that transit authorities and MaaS vendors will turn to eMobility to solve that last mile challenge. This is going to be the real way they complete this puzzle, and that's going to be really significant. So with that, it's on to trend number 5. So back to you, Scarlett.
Thank you very much, Nick. As we're now entering into our top 5, the format will change ever so slightly, insofar that we'll be taking a slightly more in-depth look at each one of the following trends. So let's dive into trend number 5, which is that telco firewalls will evolve in response to increased levels of fraudulent traffic. So to begin with, let's just set some definitions in terms of what we mean by telco firewall, which is technology that is used by operators to monitor their networks and identify potentially fraudulent traffic. Then what do we mean by fraudulent traffic? Well, simply put, this is messaging and voice traffic that is not delivered via its intended channel or its intended format. What we're seeing is some real key trends in the messaging market, which are driving change and innovation, like the growth of OTT business messaging and the emergence of RCS, rich communication services. These data-rich services are really going to drive demand for multimedia firewalls, the ability to identify different types of fraud over the different types of messaging. And in terms of messaging, fraud can occur by grey routes when lucrative A2P revenue is disguised as P2P, less expensive revenue. And we also believe that the development of VoLTE and voice over LTE and voice over 5G will complicate things further. It will require operators to monitor multiple planes, and voice firewalls will need to evolve in tandem with this to prevent illegitimate traffic. So how will the economic downturn next year really impact this trend? Well, we are anticipating limited consumer spend on value-added services, which will obviously hit operators quite hard, especially with their tight profit margins. Therefore, there'll be an increased focus on preventing revenue leakage using technologies such as AI and machine learning in order to really secure that revenue. And also, it's really imperative that consumer trust is maintained in messaging channels to protect that revenue and ensure that the operator-led channels are not jeopardized by the OTT messaging apps. So why do we think this is going to happen in 2023? Well, what we're seeing is a real sort of termination of 2G and 3G connectivity, especially in West Europe, also in the US. This is due to operators reallocating network spectrum to 4G and 5G, and this is only going to accelerate as operator rollouts gain traction. For example, in October 2022, we've seen that 3 Austria and Bharti Airtel both launched standalone 5G networks. This will really lead to an increase in data-rich messaging, which is going to put extra demand on networks and lead to the need for multimedia firewalls. But the implementation of these firewalls and the anti-fraud measures will mean that fraudsters will need to pay more to avoid detection, and therefore this will increase the price of grey route traffic, making it a less attractive option. However, fraudsters will continue to try and find ways to get around these methods, as messaging and voice will still remain lucrative channels for operators. So in terms of who will benefit here, network operators really operate within tight profit margins, and this was only exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, where roaming revenue fell quite significantly. And in order to counteract this tight profit margin and maximise revenue, operators need additional visibility over their networks to identify and then prevent the delivery of fraudulent traffic. It's key, these firewalls, to preventing fraud and therefore ensuring user confidence, as a failure to do so will lead to attrition over to OTT services, both in terms of voice and in terms of messaging. So what do we think the future holds then for next year? We anticipate that firewall vendors will really move to develop 5G-ready messaging firewalls, using AI and machine learning algorithms to evolve to the changes within the telecommunications landscape. And ultimately, these firewalls will still need to protect SMS traffic, as SMS will remain a predominant form of messaging, especially over A2P use cases. So I'll now pass you on to Sam, who will discuss trend number 4.
Thank you very much, Scarlett. The fourth trend that we have is there's going to be a greater focus on operator edge computing. So more and more use cases are demanding edge computing, but what is edge computing? Edge computing is operators moving processing power or network connectivity close to the edge of the network. And the edge of the network is where the end nodes or the end devices for cellular connectivity are. What that means is that operators are investing heavily within their networking architectures and capital investment to make sure that their networks are able to handle all this edge computing use case. And a big area for operators in rolling out these edge computing networks is the automation. So automating a network is important for operators because they need to make sure that the key network services are serving the right connections or end nodes. So as edge computing grows and more base stations and servers are placed further away from the core of a network, AI and machine learning are going to be key technologies that enable operators to ensure that the edge computing use cases are met. So why do we think 2023? Well, looking back at some of the key use cases that we would like to talk about, one of them is autonomous vehicles and public transport. And we're seeing more and more connected car services and as well as within consumer vehicles and commercial vehicles becoming increasingly connected, increasingly sophisticated, and this is generating an increased amount of data. To be clear, we're not necessarily talking about the data generated by infotainment systems or any in-car entertainment systems, but as vehicles themselves become more sophisticated, as does the data generated for maintenance, as well as improving on processes that are currently there. Now, as more and more cars become connected, that data generated becomes ever greater, and the ability for all the data that is generated to be assessed at the edge of the network at these base stations or edge nodes, as we call them, is vital for operators, because that means that as the data grows, it less and less strain on the network to deliver all this data, rather than having the data all placed within a cloud platform. The processing can be done at the edge of the network, and results can be sent back to the edge of the to the core network itself. Healthcare is a very similar area as well, and more data is being generated by healthcare connections, which means that as more and more people take a proactive healthcare, more of a proactive approach to their healthcare, what we're seeing is more and more connected devices that can generate more and more data, which again needs to be processed at the edge of the network. Now, it's interesting here, healthcare, as obviously the security of the data is as important as any other industry, as well as we're still feeling the effects of the global COVID-19 pandemic. As a result, healthcare has certainly been an industry that's seeing a lot of innovation in terms of what technology is being implemented. And industrial IoT is the same. As more and more devices are connected, as we're using more and more spectrum for wireless connectivity, we're seeing more and more data. And edge computing is a key technology that's going to work in tandem with AI, as well as technologies like 5G to provide better, more efficient networks. And one of the things that we would like to move on to is talking about the lower cost of AI, which works in tandem with the orchestration of the network. So how will the economic downturn in 2023 impact the trend? Well, first of all, there's going to be an increased demand, for lowering the operational cost, or the total cost of ownership of a network. And as you can see there, in the graph, that there's going to be an increased spend from operators. We've noticed this in our recent mobile edge computing report. That operators are increasing their spend across edge computing use cases. So who is going to be impacted? Obviously, operators and CSPs are investing in edge computing and automation to fulfill this demand. And what we're seeing is that even though operators are moving away from centralizing services and reducing their CapEx spend, edge computing is sort of looking to buck this trend a little bit. And obviously, IoT users are going to benefit from the lower operational costs when operators install edge computing. So what is our prediction? Firstly, 5G networks are obviously increasing and proliferating, and that's a technology that's going to work in tandem with edge computing solutions, being able to provide higher and higher data. Orchestration of the network is imperative. AI will be a technology that will look to learn from how networks are orchestrated now and implement it into real time, meaning that much of the operational costs can actually be saved by operators themselves. And we've identified 4 key areas that we think are going to be impacted by this rollout of edge computing. So firstly is the hardware and the infrastructure. Obviously, operators do need to invest. Is a capital investment rather than looking into virtualizing networks and relying on software, as the geographies of doing so are of rolling out edge computing is significant. Obviously, as mentioned before, AI and machine learning will be needed to implement it. And obviously, we can talk about AI and machine learning, but it's only as good as the data that can be fed into the algorithms. So operators will need to look into how to ingest as much data into the edge computing architectures as possible. And obviously, 5G network rollouts. 5G will play a huge role in enabling edge computing to take on the increase in connections, the increase in data. We find that especially important for the IoT. So as more and more IoT connections are being used, whether that be on 5G, wired connections, even over new technologies like Wi-Fi 6, then edge computing will play a significant role in making sure that all of this data is handled. And finally, we believe that even though operators are still need to minimize their capital investment into networks, edge computing is the one example where it can buck this trend. We're still seeing operators looking to virtualize networks, but the benefits of rolling out edge computing architectures far outweighs the strategy of minimizing capital investment. What I'll do now is I'll pass you on to my colleague Nick, who will take you through the next trend.
Great, thanks Sam. So on to trend number 3, which is hydrogen vehicle development to accelerate as electric vehicles hit challenges. So let's get into this trend. I think what we've been seeing is that fundamentally electric vehicles have been growing quite significantly, but there are still quite a lot of challenges in the electric vehicles market, and I think that's very clear to see. Electric vehicles tend to be pretty expensive, and that is a limiting factor, particularly when budgets for both consumers and sort of commercial fleets are being restricted by the economic climate. Electric vehicles are also struggling to meet the range requirements involved in a lot of larger commercial use cases in particular. So for example, buses, heavy goods vehicles, the development in that area has been a lot slower than in the consumer market. So that is a significant one. That low range has led to this sort of concept of range anxiety, which has been a really limiting factor with end users. So that has really limited what is going on here. The other element to this is that the charging infrastructure for electric vehicles is still pretty fragmented, and it's been fairly slow in terms of rolling out. So it's actually still fairly difficult to charge an electric vehicle. Even if you find a free charger, it may not be at the right rate. So there's lots of different permutations, and that it means that that market is struggling. That creates a bit of an opportunity for hydrogen vehicles. So we have seen growing interest in hydrogen vehicles. We've seen sort of a trickle of manufacturers investing in the development of hydrogen vehicles, and we've seen some models come to market in certain geographies. And we're really starting to see that continue now. We think 2023 will be a very big year for that. We can see in the image here that actually hydrogen vehicles do have a lot of advantages versus electric vehicles. They can, in theory, provide a very good experience. So I think manufacturers are keen to exploit this. And what we anticipate is that manufacturers will ramp up their investment in and their development of hydrogen vehicles in 2023. We're going to see a lot of this and be talking much more widely about hydrogen vehicles in 2023. So let's unpack this a bit more in terms of what this means. So looking at the economic downturn and what impact that's going to have, I think we've all seen, those of us who drive internal combustion engine cars, we've seen the impact of the fuel price crisis at gas stations, petrol stations. That's been really notable for everyone. And that is putting pressure on economies to actually accelerate their decarbonisation efforts. So that's really significant. So that is really generating pressure. And we can see on the right here that the price of oil has been really volatile and has increased quite rapidly. So there's a lot of pressure here from the economic situation. It's also meaning that electric vehicles are quite expensive to buy, and that's not great when there's not a lot of disposable income around. So that is, again, has been a limiting factor on the electric vehicle market, which creates an opportunity. And the downturn, we think, will motivate manufacturers to really start investing in hydrogen. And that's ultimately to hedge their bets. They want to build a broader portfolio. They don't want to be reliant just on electric vehicles for their future revenue. And this is the perfect time to invest to do that. And along those lines, why 2023? We've seen electric vehicles struggle to really transform mobility markets, and the deadlines for phasing out internal combustion engine cars and commercial vehicles are looming. A lot of countries have deadlines of 2030 or the early 2030s, and that means that really, in order to hit that deadline, if hydrogen is going to play a major role, which we think it is, then the investment has to come very soon. So we think that's going to be a really major factor here. So who's going to benefit from these changes to mobility? Manufacturers, it's a long-term bet for them, but they ultimately will have more diverse vehicle portfolios. As we've mentioned, they won't just be reliant on electric vehicles, and they'll have more to offer than that, which is in their interests. Users will also benefit from greater choice of vehicle type. They won't just have to choose an electric vehicle. So there is a real upside to users here, and more choice is generally a good thing in this market. And the biggest impact will likely be on commercial fleets. Hydrogen will mean that they'll be able to decarbonize more easily, and that will be critical in meeting very aggressive corporate social responsibility targets to reduce their carbon footprint and increase their environmental credentials. So that's very important, a real priority for businesses at the moment. So fundamentally, what we predict is going to happen here, and we cover this a lot more in our recent report on hydrogen vehicles. Manufacturers will increase investment in and development of hydrogen vehicle technologies, and that's really going to scale up in 2023. And also to support this, we're going to see a lot of initiatives gaining momentum on hydrogen production, which which is still a limiting factor, and the infrastructure to support it. So we're going to see a lot of related development there too. With that, it is back to Sam for trend number 2.
Thank you very much, Nick. So I'll say our penultimate trend is that satellite-based 5G networks are going to launch in 2023. So the launch of 5G satellites is mainly driven by the ability to offer connectivity to those that can't be served by a terrestrial base station. What we can see here for the infographic to the right is the ability to the ability to provide connectivity through a satellite rather than the base station is a different area that different technology, a set of technologies that can be used by operators to provide 5G connectivity. In fact, interestingly, the 3GPP, or the Third Generation Partnership Project, in their 17th release, released last year, outlined the standards for using non-terrestrial networks or non-terrestrial equipment for the provision of 5G. In fact, what we're seeing already is device vendors such as Apple are already using these technologies. So why do we think 2023? I mean, this year we've already seen a number of notable service providers. Starlink and Amazon, for example, are key players in this market that announced that they are, using satellites or low orbit satellites to provide 5G connectivity. We've already seen the ability of companies, or the technologies from companies like Starlink, to provide high bandwidth or high throughput internet connectivity to places where they normally cannot. Additionally, it's probably got to be noted as well that the terrestrial base stations that are currently used have a very they have a range that, when in comparison to the satellites, is very, very limited, meaning that investment into the satellites compared to terrestrial base stations are essentially two different markets, and these return on investments need to be carefully considered. However, you also need to look at things like backhaul infrastructure for terrestrial base stations, things like fiber networks, rollouts, providing that last mile solution for base stations versus what that means for satellite-based 5G. And moving on, how do we think that the economic downturn is going to have an impact on 2023? Well, I think the most immediate point to make is obviously that a return on investment into any cellular or operator-based technologies never really happens within 12 months. Operator standards are released, or major operator-based standards are released in time periods, spanning years rather than months, which means that the lead time for many of these services, including satellite-based 5G, is significant. So operators will need to be partnering and looking at the best way for the return on investment into satellite-based 5G. As you can see to the right is the total number of 5G connections. So who is going to be impacted by this trend? As we've already mentioned, it's not cost effective for the operators for the satellite-based 5G networks for them to launch it independently. First of all, it's not within their core capabilities. They're going to need, operators are going to need the financial backing or partnerships with the internet satellite service providers. They're the companies that either have the financial resources for large-scale launches, and more importantly, they have the in-house knowledge to best create these networks that can integrate with existing terrestrial-based 5G networks. As mentioned, companies such as Starlink and Amazon that we mentioned before benefit. They can look to make lucrative partnerships with these operators. We believe that many of these technology conglomerates are going to be partnering with multiple operators across different regions, as the geographies don't really have any significant impact into how many partnerships and what coverage can be done. Multiple operators may be using the same satellite in the same way that spectrum sharing or base station sharing agreements operate today. And obviously at present these networks are only being used for emergencies, but looking forward into next year and how these networks can be used, you're looking at areas with low coverage that not served currently by terrestrial base stations. What we're going to see is operators looking to see what the impact of these satellite launches are on their current plans for terrestrial base station rollouts. So, what is our prediction? More importantly, we see there's going to be more dedicated 5G satellite launches. I think as an ecosystem already, the cellular or the telecommunications market is one that's very sophisticated, and adding in more tech conglomerates for the 5G satellite launches is something that we'll see develop more and more over the next year, but we will see satellite launches. And as I said, large technology launches will be the ones that will need to invest. Operators need to be looking to partner with these companies. There's a significant investment into infrastructure, but as the standards are already there, there's a perfect platform for all of these stakeholders to look to push on with the market and look into satellite-based 5G investments. And one thing we expect not to happen, we expect from a consumer's point of view, whether that be an enterprise consumer or somebody in the consumer market itself, we expect that operators and service providers themselves must not differentiate or separate the terrestrial 5G market from the satellite-based 5G market, regardless of connectivity. These users must not be charged a premium or understand even that whether it's going for a terrestrial base station or satellite base station. And that means that operators need to consider even more their investment into 5G and how to secure a return on investment. But one of the use cases we've noted that will probably benefit immediately beyond the emergency services market is FWA, or fixed wireless access. This is the ability to provide internet connectivity through 5G connections. And one last point to make, we believe that satellite-based launches are going to provide a significant impact on how the 6G networks in the future will launch. We believe we're only 5 to 6 years away from commercial 6G network launches, and we believe that these launches will play a significant role in research and development of how these 6G networks are built in the future. And now on to our final trend. I will hand you back over to Nick Maynard to take you through trend number 1.
Great, thanks, Sam. So trend number 1 is increased investment into smart grid technologies driven by the energy crisis. So let's have a look at this. What we're seeing is that the security of energy supplies is a real pressing issue for governments across the world. And that's been driven by a couple of different elements. We've seen, obviously, the Russia-Ukraine conflict has had a big role, particularly in Europe, in destabilizing energy markets. But also, on top of that, is the ongoing pressure to decarbonize. So the combination of those factors has really created a perfect storm in the energy market. That has been something that has been a major concern for governments and utility providers, and even end users as they see their energy bills skyrocket. So really, we've seen a lot of disruption here, and that's going to have a very significant impact going forward. Governments and energy companies will ultimately be drastically increasing their smart grid investment to boost resilience within energy grids. By adding elements such as AI and machine learning, and being able to more accurately understand what the peak usage is, where sort of the usage flows, that capability will create real resilience in the network by being able to do other things, such as, for example, incentivizing users to reduce their power usage at certain points. So that's going to be really important. And we can see some of the key benefits of smart grid deployments on the right. Increased network resilience there is key, as well as improved efficiency. This can reduce energy usage, which is really important, particularly at the moment. Increased end user involvement and incentivization for those users to actually reduce their energy usage. That's going to be key, and sort of gamifying that energy usage. And being able to integrate renewables better and actually make them work with the overall grid in a more cohesive way. And ultimately, all of this will enable economies to better achieve their decarbonisation goals, which is really critical and a massive issue of our times. So this will fundamentally allow governments to better deal with their energy requirements, and it will set up a more sustainable future energy market, which is really a #1 priority for a lot of governments around the world with the current difficulties. So looking into why this is happening and how the economic downturn will impact this trend. We've got some stats on the UK cost of electricity here. So this is the wholesale costs, and we can see that it's not difficult to interpret that graph. The increase has been very significant, and more increases are forecast in the future. So that's a very tricky situation, and high energy prices are a key contributing factor towards inflation across major economies. So this is having a real effect and impact. Alongside this, bringing those costs down, that's a major priority strategically for governments across the world. And that's been particularly felt within the US and Europe, but that's a real priority. And that's something that smart grid is actually really well placed to help those governments achieve. And why 2023? We think this winter will be a big motivating factor for that. It's proving very difficult to manage. We've had various energy authorities talking about the possibility of blackouts, which I think is very alarming for a lot of governments and ultimately the people in their homes and businesses. So that's a real concern, and that will generate further investment into smart grid in order to make a more resilient network where that isn't the case. And that will, those recent events that we've talked about will mean that actually governments will prioritize investment here, even as other budgets are shrinking. So that's going to be really noteworthy. So looking at who will benefit, businesses and consumers will eventually benefit from falls in energy prices. Increased efficiency means that there will be a knock-on effect, and this is a good thing in terms of having that impact. We'll also see that governments will really benefit from increased resilience and reliability in the energy grid. As we've mentioned, that's been a major source of concern and will be keeping key leaders up at night. So this is something that's really important and will be a real benefit here. So ultimately, our prediction here is that smart grid investment is going to rapidly accelerate, driven by the energy crisis, and we're going to see a lot more, many more announcements of new initiatives in countries, acceleration of smart meter rollouts, and a lot more work in the analytics field as well to make sense of all this data that smart meters are generating and really drive the benefits here that smart grid can entail. And in the longer term, what we'll see in the energy market is an increased shift towards renewable and nuclear power to further increase resilience in networks and really sort of chart out the future of energy markets in many different markets. And with that, it is back to my colleague Sam for the recap and the question and answers.
Thank you very much, Nick. Yeah, that wraps up our top 10 tech predictions for 2023. Just before we move on to the Q&A section, we'd like to very quickly recap the trends. There is a common theme throughout the majority of these, and that is the economic downturn. There are a few examples where service providers are looking to reduce their expenditure, such as CBRS or AI driving the adoption of precision medicine. And additionally, it's all about improving user experiences at a time when the economic uncertainty is causing services to have to innovate essentially, and that's well highlighted within eMobility and Trend 5, the Telco Firewalls. And I think as we said, the economic downturn is really the driving factor between how many of these trends are going to happen next year. Now we're going to quickly move on to the Q&A session. We've had a few questions in. One of the questions is from Philip, and this is: how will CBRS play into edge computing? It's a very interesting question because CBRS and edge computing are essentially looking to solve very similar problems. What this means is that what they're doing is looking to reduce latency or increase output or increase the efficiencies of networks. However, they're going about it in two very different ways, and certainly two different markets. CBRS is for almost the private network owner, while edge computing is leveraging public networks for public connections, which means, again, they're two very, very different ways of providing cellular connectivity or wireless connectivity. Another question that we've had is from Alicia regarding A2P inboxes. So I'll pass this one to you, Scarlett. What are the best strategies for OTT messaging apps to keep the disruption from separating A2P and P2P inboxes down to a minimum?
So, like we've mentioned, these OTT messaging apps have a real sort of established P2P, person-to-person use case. And like you say, Sam, we've really got to keep the disruption to a minimum. How this will look, we anticipate that there will be set inboxes following the example of applications like the native Android messaging application, but also Google Mail inboxes. And what's also really important is that enterprises make their consumers aware that they are on these OTT messaging apps, so that any messages they receive that are from legitimate businesses are not misidentified as fraudulent.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And we've had a few other questions we've received today. And what we'll be doing is we'll be reviewing them, and we'll be getting in touch with you after the webinar to make sure that all questions are answered. That brings us to the end of our top 10 tech predictions. We do hope you found this insightful today. We will be making a recording of this available on our YouTube channel and our website. And by the end of the week, we will also be publishing a more in-depth white paper highlighting some more specificity into these top 10 trends. If you have any questions or would like to know more about our reports, you can contact us to Juniper Research directly via the contact details provided on your screen now. Once again, thank you for joining us, and it's bye for now.